Record. All right. Well, welcome everybody. So good to see all of you. Welcome to our Lunch and Learn, Changing the Paradigm of Neurodiversity, Acceptance, Inclusion, and Social Justice. My name is Olga Marable. I'm the Director of Outreach for Fusion Academy, representing our 7 campuses in the DMV, in Virginia, Maryland, and DC. For those who are not familiar with Fusion, we are a revolutionary private middle and high school serving 6th through 12th grade, where positive relationships unlock academic potential. All courses are one-to-one, one student and one teacher per classroom. This allows teachers to customize curriculum and teaching for each student's individual strengths, interests, and learning style. Our supportive campus environment is a unique space that includes a state-of-the-art recording studio, mixed media art studio, and a homework cafe where students complete all their homework before going home. Flexible scheduling lets students enroll at any time of the year and take classes at any time of the day that works best for them. We also offer tutoring support, still in a one-to-one setting, with over 250 course offerings. And we are enrolling students right now for summer credit recovery, acceleration, as well as our summer skills camps. We offer a fine balance between academics as well as the social and emotional support through the homework cafe, clubs, and other activities held on campus and off campus. The 7 campuses that I mentioned throughout the area include our DC campus, Loudoun, Reston, Tysons, Alexandria, Rockville, and Columbia, as well as our 100% virtual school program. So that's just a little bit about Fusion for those who are not familiar. I want to go over a little bit of housekeeping before we jump into the presentation too. So this is being recorded, as you guys can see. Please feel free to turn your camera off if you'd like, but we're only able to see the first couple faces anyways, but I definitely want to make sure that you are comfortable. The PowerPoint and the presentation will be sent to everybody. So the recording will be sent to everybody along with the PowerPoint afterwards. If you can please mute yourself, I would really appreciate that so that way we don't disturb the speakers. And then if you can rename yourself, I would really appreciate that. To rename yourself in the window, your first and last name. This gets really helpful for when we get to the Q&A portion, so that way I can call on you by your real name versus your child's name or just some letters and numbers. The chat will remain open for collaboration and networking. So please feel free to utilize that. Feel free to drop resources, your own business information. It is definitely there for that. The presenters will not be moderating the chat throughout the presentation, but I will be for sure. And you can always private chat me if you want to send me a direct message. We are going to hold on to questions until the end for Q&A, but you're ask questions throughout, and I will hold on to them. I will keep track of all the questions. So when we get to the Q&A, or maybe we will even pause in the middle, we'll go through them in order. Just make sure that when we get to questions, you keep them appropriate and not too personal. There's a lot of people on here today, so we want to make sure that we have time to answer everybody's questions as well. All right, so about today's speakers. We have 2 wonderful speakers today. The first is Dr. Melissa Smith. She's a clinical psychologist and board certified in school neuropsychology. She's the director of testing, tutoring, and counseling at the Treatment and Learning Centers. And our second speaker is Tina Morrissey. Oh my gosh, I didn't have how to pronounce that, so I hope I'm saying it right.
Morrissey.
Perfect, thanks Tina. She's a certified speech language pathologist. She is the director of the Outpatient Speech Language Pathology Department at the Treatment and Learning Centers. So without further ado, I will pass it over to our wonderful speakers.
Thank you, Olga. So thank you everyone for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us and hear the information regarding changing the paradigm of neurodiversity, acceptance, inclusion, and social justice. As Olga said, my name is Tina Morrissey, and my pronouns are she and her, and I'm the director of the Outpatient Speech Language Pathology Department at the Treatment and Learning Centers.
And I am Dr. Melissa Smith. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a clinical psychologist and also the director of testing, tutoring, and counseling at TLC.
The Treatment and Learning Centers, or TLC, has been in the community for over 70 years. We are an outpatient and non-public private special needs school We have children at our Catherine Thomas School in preschool through 12th grade, all along the neurodiverse spectrum. We also offer outpatient services. We have a variety of departments. We have services for adults called our outcomes department that helps with vocational and independent living skills. We also have a department that works primarily with pediatrics, our occupational therapy and speech language pathology, as well as feeding departments. And then our testing, tutoring, counseling, and audiology departments work with both pediatrics as well as adults. Our testing, tutoring, and counseling department not only offers testing services such as neuropsychological, psychoeducational, and psychological testing, but it also offers tutoring, virtual as well as in person, as well as counseling services. So our talk today, our disclaimer before we get started, is that we are here as allies. We are here to listen to the voices of neurodiverse people and to amplify those voices as best we can, but also to let you know that we also have a shared identity with those on the neurodiverse spectrum, as I have a learning disability, I have a mathematical disorder.
And I have a learning disability, reading.
So when we talk about neurodiversity today, and hopefully you will take some information about, new information about neurodiversity, this is something that hopefully you can picture two more people on the spectrum of neurodiversity, Melissa and myself, so that you'll have two more faces in mind or two more people in mind when you think about the very large spectrum that is the neurodiverse community.
Okay, so there's a lot we're going to cover. And so we wanted just some broad objectives to help you as you continue on and kind of think through what we're going to talk today about. First is really understanding intersectionality. We're going to bring that up a lot. We think it's really important to think about intersectionality in terms of neurodiversity, race, gender, sexuality, and other intersections of identity. We're going to talk about disability justice, and we're going to compare disability rights to disability justice, because as the movement has progressed, that is really where the movement has shifted from. And lastly, as you walk away, we're really hoping that you come away with kind of your mind turning about what are the types of accommodations, supports, and even structural changes that you can be a part of, advocate for, or implement in your own communities, work environments, schools, and other areas of your life.
So we'll start off with some defining terms. What is neurodiversity? Neurodiversity is the variation in neurocognitive functioning, and it's really an umbrella term. It does encompass those who are autistic, have ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette syndrome, anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, depression, intellectual disabilities, schizophrenia. But it's also important to keep in mind, and many people don't consider this, that it also includes what we consider neurotypical, or what people refer to as neurotypical presentations. So this umbrella in term includes all brains. It's not necessarily brains that are not neurotypical. It includes all brains and all natural variations of neurodiversity. So the brains of people who have learning disabilities, ADHD, autistic brains, neurotypical brains, all of these brains are under this umbrella. It's important to think about neurodiversity to consider that there is no right or wrong brain, that neurodiverse people are not necessarily considered failed versions of normal. And I think that sometimes that's the default in our society, that we consider a neurotypical brain to be the prototype or the goal or the thing we want to get closer to. And our goal is to try and get neurodiverse brains to look more like neurotypical brains, but that's not the case. So neurotypical brains, neurodiverse brains, all under that same umbrella. Also bring your attention to the fact that in the background of this slide, we have an infinity symbol. The infinity symbol that looks like a rainbow is the symbol for neurodiversity. So we've moved away from puzzle pieces being representative of the autistic community, and instead we're embracing a new symbol, the infinity symbol. The infinity symbol is representative of diversity. It's representative of untapped potential and endless possibilities. And you may also see a gold infinity symbol that's more specific to the autistic community, whereas this one that is rainbow is more specific to the neurodiverse community in general. Some other defining terms, the spectrum. I think when a lot of people hear the word spectrum, they think of it as being linear, and there's less autistic on one end and more autistic on the other. But when we refer to the spectrum, then the new considerations will also include more neurodiverse people. So the spectrum is not necessarily just autistic. It includes those who have learning disabilities, ADHD, intellectual disabilities, anxiety. These are all the spectrum. It's also important to think about when we consider the spectrum that it's not a linear in terms of gradations, but it's more like a pie chart. And everybody's chart is going to represent different parts of themselves, and they're all going to look a little different. So my chart is going to look different than Melissa's chart, though we both share the same label of a learning disability. So mine's going to have difficulties with visual spatial skills, telling time, counting money. It's going to have strengths in language. Melissa's or somebody else's may not have those same qualities or those same strengths or those same needs for support. And it's also important to consider that those could change. So that's just not my static pie chart or my static spectrum. That could change depending on how tired I am, how taxed I am, or if there's anything else happening that is amplifying some of my, my needs for support at that time. So it's also important to consider the identity first language versus person first language. So the language that we're going to use is consistent with what the neurodiverse community and specifically the autistic community has told us, is that we cannot separate autism from the person. So instead of referring to people with autism or a child with autism, you'll hear us use the identity that someone is autistic, an autistic child or an autistic adult. And that is directly from the voices of those in that community. We touched a little bit on low functioning, high functioning in terms of the spectrum, but I think this is an important consideration. These are some other terms that are not used anymore in the community. So in terms of thinking of someone as high functioning, and that has traditionally been referred to as someone who can communicate, or I've heard it referred to as you would never know there was something wrong with them, high functioning. And then we have low functioning. Those are usually thought of as people who are don't use their voice to communicate. But these are very harmful and incredibly inaccurate terms. They deny support to people because it's the assumption that someone who is thought of as high functioning maybe doesn't need help with something. And when they ask for it, it's not there. Or someone with low functioning needs all these supports, and there's no assumption of competence or allowance for independence. So these are not terms that you'll be hearing us use anymore. The other thing with these terms is that they're usually compared to neurotypical, again, as if neurotypical was somehow the prototype, the thing that we want to aspire to. Another consideration is that they're just inaccurate. So when we think of people who, for example, do not use their voice to communicate, traditionally people have said that those are nonverbal people. But instead of using nonverbal, which sort of has this implication of inability to communicate, which isn't true because all people communicate, then another more accurate term would be to think of it as someone who is non-speaking. And that really gives equal weight to the way in which they're communicating, whether that is verbal, or if it's using a speech generating device or sign language, or pictures to communicate, or gestures or sounds. So it's really important when we're thinking about these terms to think about why we're using them and why we're not using these terms. Another thing to consider is moving away from a deficits model. So when we're thinking about high functioning and low functioning, thinking about the words that we use to describe people who are on the spectrum, the neurodiverse spectrum, a lot of times we use words like red flags or warning signs. So we will say, you know, seems like that person is lining things up. I think that's a warning sign or a red flag for autism. You should get that checked out. Using those kinds of words really isn't helpful, and it really makes neurodiversity seem like something that we shouldn't be proud of or that we shouldn't be okay with. Because again, the idea is that there's red flags, they could be different. They could be not neurotypical. So when we're thinking about these terms, it's important to consider using more accurate terms and making sure also that when we're referring to the spectrum, that we are being as honoring those voices of those who have told us what terms they prefer to use as possible.
Other things that we want to make sure that we're in, kind of unison in terms of understanding when Tina and I talk about these terms, we want to make sure that you're aware of what we mean by them. So race, gender, sexuality, sexual orientation are social constructs. So that's our baseline That means that they're not biological facts. They're not scientifically an objective reality. They are constructed through history, time, our culture, our traditions, and the things that we believe in our belief system. So starting off, race. I've gone to a number of continuing education, and at times there's this assumption that race is at least in part based on biology, based on genetics in some way. And that's false. It's not based on anything except a social construct. Some of this may be due to genealogy studies and ancestry.com, which might link to a particular place of origin. That leads to that particular place of origin. However, there's no genetic markers that, for example, would connect someone from Indonesia to someone from Japan, to someone from Thailand, to someone from India, and disconnect them from everybody else. But it just does not exist. Similarly, there's no genetic markers that connect people from Haiti to people from the Congo, to people from Jamaica, to people from South Africa, and disconnect them from everybody else. These things don't exist. We've constructed them and decided that if you're from a particular place, we have assigned a race to that place, and that place connects to other places we have assigned the same race to. So that's kind of a baseline. Gender, similarly, is constructed over time based on our norms, our belief systems, and we come over time to just assume they're true. And yet, we'll see, very strong variations even in cultural ideas of gender. For example, a long time ago, I was a professor at Montgomery College, and I had a Iranian student who was very surprised that we, color-coded our children. She said that they never do that in Iran, that they don't have pink girls, dressed in blue boys. It's just not something we do, and yet we see that as very normal in our society. So gender varies, and we're evolving in our understanding that gender is not not dichotic. It is not one thing. And so that's another social construct. Sexual orientation, again, about who you're attracted to, who you love, but we're also learning that there is not kind of a either or sexual orientation. That was kind of where we began kind of searching and understanding this from our cultural norms, right? Sexual orientation is very broad and very vast. And in all of that, there's intersectionality. What that means is all of us have different intersections where identities meet. And at those intersections can be places of privilege, or they can be places of disadvantage and oppression. And so understanding that is going to be really important to thinking about the whole person and where they're coming from. So Patty Byrne in 2015 wrote a white paper where she really described the movement from disability rights to disability justice. The disability rights movement was a really powerful movement. It was a time in which people said, I deserve rights, right? I deserve access to schools. I deserve access to a place of employment. I deserve access to the ability to move throughout my community. And there were a lot of assumptions about people with disabilities that they couldn't work or they couldn't get access to these things. And so there was a very strong movement that included sit-ins and included protests that really led us on the path to really having stronger disability rights, right? The IDEA movement in schools, our laws regarding accessibility in careers and in vocations and in the community. And so this was a really powerful movement that led us to see that we were creating so many barriers to people with disabilities. And yet, Patty Byrne begins to describe that even with this movement, as powerful as it was making invisible the lives of people, as she said, who lives at the intersection of junctures of oppression. Disabled people of color, immigrants with disabilities, queers with disabilities, trans and gender nonconforming people with disabilities, amongst others. And so that Patty really advocated for the movement to disability justice. Disability justice is really looking at cross-disability, sensory, intellectual, mental health, neurodiversity, physical mobility, and really thinking about how all of those intersections impact our access, how we're able to self-determine our life, and how we identify. And so disability justice really works to see the person as their whole self, not one aspect of their identity, but how their whole self intersects and can lead to increasing levels of oppression, advantage, and the like. And so there's She has a number of principles, but there's 3 core principles. The first is intersectionality, as I talked about before. Patty says, we know that each person has multiple community identifications and that each identity can be a side of privilege or oppression. And so when we're thinking about who is making the decisions and who is included and what equity is given access to, people with disabilities often are greatly underrepresented in these discussions. It seems like obvious that these people would be included, and yet we're not included. And even more true if you are someone with a disability and in a minoritized group. And so when you think about inclusion and you think about who people with disabilities are, what comes to your mind? Do you have a prototype? An autistic child? Do you think about, an automatic, prototype of who that person is? We also know that research has shown increasingly that autistic individuals tend to more highly identify on the LGBTQ+ spectrum. So are we giving them access? Are we allowing for that inclusion so that those voices are heard and shared? Another key principle is leadership of the most impacted. I mentioned this just earlier about people with disabilities, neurodivergent communities often being excluded from these conversations. And when we exclude people, similarly, if we're excluding people from any conversation, such as racial equity, what then do our conversations end up resulting in? As Tina said, neurodiversity is often seen as separate from neurotypicality, right? And neurodivergence is often seen as like the problem. We want to get them more neurotypical. How do we get them more neurotypical? As opposed to listening to people from neurodiverse communities and really what is impacting them the most and what do they need? And lastly, recognizing wholeness. I love this quote. We value people as they are for who they are, not what they can produce. And if we think about American culture, productivity is a super high bar that we have, right? Your worth is often very dependent on what you can produce, what you can give. It's also very dependent on your intelligence, on your attractiveness. And we then place values on human life based on that. And so then what does that mean for how we treat, how we perceive, and how we think about neurodiverse individuals?
So putting disability justice concepts into practice. What does this mean? Take some of the information and see if we can put it all together and put it into practice. So the first thing is considering some paradigm shifts. So these are going to be shifting the paradigm from awareness to acceptance. So we have a lot of autism awareness campaigns and days and ribbons, but moving from just awareness to awareness and acceptance of brains that work differently. I love this quote: neurodiversity may be every bit as crucial for the human race as biodiversity is for life in general. Who can say what form of wiring will be best at any given moment? So again, moving away from that deficits model to a supports model, that's a paradigm shift that we should consider. And what would a support model look like? It would look like including opportunities and support for self-advocacy, for accessibility to communication, for tools and accessibility for co-regulation, and for accessibility and tools to access mental health services. So it's really embracing neurodivergence, acknowledging it, including it, amplifying, and celebrating the perspectives of neurodivergent individuals. The paradigm shift is also going to consider how we think about neurodivergence and moving from a cure model, it's something to be cured and fixed, it's something that is wrong, to instead to that support model. If you think about the research that has been done on autism, specifically maybe the last 30 years or so, historically, the majority of it is to address genetics or biology. How is this happening? And the implication is so that we can make sure it doesn't happen again. But really, that's not helpful. So it would be better if the research, for example, was about services to help autistic people, not how to make sure that we can fix it, cure it, or make sure it doesn't happen again. So that paradigm shift, and just 30 years ago, curing autism was the thing people donated money to, but that's a shift. That's not where we are now. And so instead of curing it, Instead, we can support, embrace, and welcome. Another example, and I think this Combating Autism Act is a very good example of that, is in 2014, there was an act called the Combating Autism Act. And just those words, combating autism. You know, when I think of myself, I'm not autistic. I don't think of myself as autistic, but I think of myself as being on the neurodiverse spectrum. I put my name in there. How would I feel if it was the Combating Tina Act? That's personal to me. So moving from the idea that we're combating autism to instead renaming it Autism Cares. And it sounds like it's just words, but it matters because it's how we think about this. So instead of saying we're going to combat autism, instead it'd be something more helpful to think about collaboration, accountability, research, education, and support. And just that change really shows that paradigm shift from where we were just in 2014 to now. Another paradigm shift is something we discussed earlier when we were talking more about the infinity symbol. And it's the idea of moving from just symbols in general of autism to being puzzle pieces. And the insinuation that someone is a puzzle to be fixed or a missing piece, some of these images that go along with that puzzle piece. So again, just moving that paradigm shift from the idea of fixing and curing to embracing. It's also important to shift this paradigm so that we can encourage people to be more authentically themselves. Instead, when we don't have this shift, we're encouraging masking. We're encouraging someone to hide or to not be who they are. I think that another example of this shift is in the neurodiverse, but specifically the autistic community. When someone gets diagnosed, the reception in the autistic community is congratulations, welcome to the club. It's not, I'm so sorry to hear, are you okay? I'm so sorry to hear that. And I think it's important that we do the same when parents share, my child was diagnosed with fill in blank here, that the answer to that is not, I'm so sorry to hear that, but okay, great. What can I do? What supports? What do you need? How can I act differently? Or how can I make my house more welcoming to them? So again, this is just that paradigm shift. So we've shifted paradigms, and now we're going to go from a cure model to a support model. So what would that look like? Supports can fluctuate throughout the day or over time, over the course of an hour. It's not one size fits all. I think that's really important to keep in mind when we're making sensory diets and accommodations, knowing that these are a list of things that could be used, but then not getting frustrated when we say, well, I turned off the lights, it didn't work. Okay, it may not have worked in that moment. That may be something that's appropriate for when someone's feeling that the light is too much for them, not necessarily every time they present as being dysregulated, lights off is going to fix it or help them. So it's important to consider that fluctuation. It's important to consider increasing our awareness of what neurodiversity looks like in society. So not just as a diagnosis, but it's more than a label. What does that look like in the workplace? What does it look like in class? What does it look like at the stores? It's important to amplify the voices from the neurodiverse community, and especially in other minoritized groups. So this could be something like access to mental health, and the comorbid disorders of anxiety and depression that come often with those on the neurodiverse spectrum. And again, moving from the paradigm shift from supports being the exception to the rule. When we go to stores now, we expect to see wheelchair access. We expect to see parking that is close to the store. We expect that there's going to be closed captioning if somebody has difficulty with hearing or is deaf. We're not surprised when we see sign language interpreters. These are part of our society as supports. Why not making supports for those who are neurodiverse as similar and as common as some of these other supports are? What happens for those who don't get supports? Because that's certainly the society that we live in. We're not there yet, right? We're still in our paradigm shift. So what happens? Well, one is masking. I sort of referred to this before. What is masking? It's hiding being neurodiverse so that you'll be accepted, or you'll gain access so that people won't look at you funny, or so that you'll get a job, or you'll keep your job, or you'll keep your friends. So it's really hiding who you are. hiding your feelings, maybe pretending to put on a facial expression that doesn't match how you feel because that's what you've been taught to do. It may be trying to use verbal language when you would much rather be using augmentative communication, when verbal language is causing you stress or distress. It's bottling up stims so that you don't look weird or you don't look different or people don't treat you differently because you're not doing what is considered neurotypical. It's having conversations like a neurotypical person would. So maybe having a very linear instead of a tangential conversation because you're afraid of what would happen if you were to have a conversation in the way that makes sense to you. It is having the feeling that you have to fake. And sometimes the problem is this, of course, is faking until you break. And so that leads to meltdowns. And meltdowns are truly neurological events like a seizure. So there is something happening when the person who has a neurodiverse brain is overwhelmed and things are too much. And this could be because of sensory, it could be because of anxiety, it could be because of depression, or just environmental things that are happening that are out of their control that they can't get out of. So when we're thinking about meltdowns, it's important to consider that this is the result of someone who does not have supports, either in the environment or personally, or access to mental health services. Meltdowns can result in someone being self-harming, self-isolating, curling up in a ball. It could look like shaking, fatigue, crying, screaming. It could look like just completely withdrawing. But a meltdown is something that is incredibly uncomfortable. It comes in waves and stages, and it takes sometimes a while to recover from. So meltdowns are, again, the result of not being supported. And then we think about the comorbid conditions of depression, anxiety, and leading to poor self-image. There's a lot of bullying in the schools, but there's also a lot of bullying in the workplace and in society and within families and within, communities for being different or looking different. And so all of these things can lead to poor self-image. And it's not necessarily that something special has to happen in order for someone to feel good or feel welcome. It's that someone has to be not ostracized, not bullied, not separated, not put down. These meltdowns can cause extreme distress as a result of masking, of course. But another comparison is sort of like thinking about masking, how we think about, and still today, but a little bit more, years ago, folks in the LGBTQIA plus community, in terms of being in the closet, having to fake it, having to go to a social event and introduce your partner as your roommate or introduce your partner as just a friend. So that idea of hiding or masking who you are from even those in your own family or those in your own community, these are the results.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about strategies and interventions from a disability justice framework. This PowerPoint will be available after our presentation, so we do recognize that there's a lot of information we're sharing, and you'll be able to look at it more later as well. One of the first things we need to consider when we're doing interventions is, why are we intervening? What is the reason? And the bigger question is, who are we intervening for? Are we intervening for our neurodiverse community, or are we intervening for our neurotypical community? What do I mean by that? Well, I'll share a client, obviously disguised, but I have a middle school girl who's autistic who I've been seeing for quite a while. She comes to my office, she sits behind the chair on the carpet, she's on her phone, doesn't make much eye contact, and we have really engaging conversations about things that are important to her, about her life, her friends, her school, her home. None of my goals for her have to do with eye contact. None of my goals for her have to do with whether or not she'll sit in that chair and look at me. None of my goals have to do with whether she'll be off her phone. In fact, being on her phone helps her regulate her emotions so she can talk about really difficult things at times. Because those aren't important to her, and they don't impact our ability to communicate and work on things that are important. And so those goals would actually be for a neurotypical person. So they will feel more comfortable with her. So she would be more accepted by them. This quote, "I'm autistic," which means everyone around me has a disorder that makes them say things they don't mean, not care about structure, fail to hyperfocus on singular important topics, have unreliable memories, drop weird hints, and creepily stare into my eyeballs. So why do people say you're the weird one? Because there's more of them than me. So if we just entertain the idea of, what if autistic individuals were the majority? what would we need to do to be masking? What sort of behaviors would we have that would be seen as weird or awkward or things we need to change? My client also does stemming sometimes. Again, this doesn't impact her relatedness. This does not impact how we communicate. And so when we think about why we're intervening and what we're intervening for, we really need to focus on how our interventions are improving the quality of life from our clients' perspectives, from their families' perspectives, not from a neurotypical perspective.
So we're considering supports. How do we do it differently? We can use it through a strengths-based support system. Instead of looking at necessarily, as Melissa had said, stimming and lack of eye contact and echolalia as pathology, as things to be fixed or changed. Instead, we can look at what strength this person bring to the table. Neurodiversity brings different ways of processing information. This different way of processing information are strengths. They're not pathology. When I think about in my own field in speech language pathology, we have a tendency to think about echolalia as something, and I don't think so much as much anymore, but historically, at least when I was first in the field, as something that was a sign of poor language skills and was a sign of something that had to be addressed. We were looking, and goals were written to eliminate or reduce echolalia, because that was considered not something that was positive or not something that was helpful or functional. But instead, we're now embracing Gestalt language learners and learning that delayed echolalia, or what people call scripting, that's just another way to communicate. Why should we eliminate it? If someone is using it, they're communicating. Just like I wouldn't like it if someone asked me to speak differently or change my dialect or change the way that I'm presenting information. Why ask somebody else to change their effective communication strategies? An example of this is, years ago when I was in high school, so in the 90s, I babysat a little boy who was autistic. And back then we used to have a channel that was on game shows. It just played game shows all day long. And he loved this channel. And so when I would babysit for him, I would tell him things like, okay, buddy, it's time to go to bed. And his response was, thanks for playing, try again later. And that let me know, no, he did not want to go to bed right now. He had this bowl that changed colors when you put something hot in it, like a hypercolor bowl. And so if the macaroni and cheese wasn't hot enough and it didn't change the color of the bowl, he would want it back in the microwave. And he would say, let's see what's behind door number 2. And that meant put the macaroni and cheese back in the microwave. This worked. I figured out he wanted more mac and cheese. He wanted it hotter and he didn't want to go to bed. These were effective strategies for him. And looking back on it, I think that is something that, he thought of all by himself, right? He independently thought of these ways to communicate. What a smart guy. And so instead of putting that as a goal to be addressed, maybe that's just something that we can support. Another way to think about strength-based model, of course, is that people who are neurodiverse can have areas of passion or intense interest. This can be seen as a diagnostic symptom, or it can be seen as a strength. And we can use that, and we can build on that, and we can use that to celebrate. They may have the ability to problem solve in unique ways, to have a history of overcoming obstacles. This can lead to empathy. This can make someone a very good friend or a very good partner. So again, using those life experiences because of their neurodiverse, using it as a strength. And finally, considering when we have a strength-based model, are we embracing the intersectionality of these strength-based supports? Are we considering that somebody who has a learning disability may have different needs than someone who is autistic, but specifically that person? Are we considering that that person is also queer and autistic? Do they need different supports than someone who has a learning disability and anxiety? Are we considering that intersectionality to make sure that we're being effective? So there's lots of places where we can help with supports. One of them is, of course, school. So there are several ways. This is just a quick snapshot to give you a jumping off point and a framework to start thinking differently, to start changing your own paradigm. We can provide, for example, sensory-friendly learning spaces that don't necessarily require an IEP to access. I have a learning disability, as I said, and when I was in school, I didn't have an IEP, but I needed supports. And thankfully, I had teachers and staff in school who were able to give me what I needed, which was extended time. I needed to be able to count on my fingers or have scratch paper so that I could do calculations, even up into 8th and 9th grade. Calculations that most people would have been able to do in their head. So having access to that scrap paper, which wasn't always allowed without a discussion because that could be perceived as cheating. But these are all strategies that I used that I didn't have an IEP for, and I'm grateful. I don't think I would have been able to do what I needed to do if I didn't have them. But a lot of children are not allowed these, and their learning is hindered by that because there's a lot of red tape and barriers put in the way for them just to simply be able to access some supports to be able to get through school. It's also encouraging multiple ways to demonstrate learning. So that could be with untimed work or maybe flexible options for class participation. Instead of calling on somebody who maybe has anxiety or is trying to fend off a meltdown in that moment, maybe, for example, they could have a little Post-it note that they put on their desk, and that lets the teacher know, I'm not ready to be called on right now. We're only calling on people who are raising their hands. Or maybe that could be something like having someone submit something via writing instead of being able to verbalize it if they're having a moment in which their verbal skills are not their strength at that moment. Rethinking classroom-wide behavior charts. Classroom-wide behavior charts are, when I think of them, I generally think of that red light, green light, yellow light model. But this is really something that just reinforces those who are neurotypical and are able to sit at the table with their lips together, their mouth shut, their hands down, their feet down, and looking at the teacher. This just really reinforces those folks, and instead, and also, shames the people who are not able to do that, who tend to be more on the neurodiverse spectrum. So what does behavior really have to, this preferred behavior have to look like? Can we move away from 1, 2, 3, eyes on me? Can we move away from quiet hands, quiet feet, quiet mouth, sit at the table, I need your hands down? Do we really need that in order to have participation or to have learning? Probably not. And so can we be a little bit more flexible with that? And then if someone is having difficulty and needs supports, can we individualize it instead of having this behavior chart, which lets the whole class know these kids are the kids who are struggling, these kids are the kids who are not doing it right, and really just starts to shame them instead of supporting them? Can we value functional use of visuals or notes over memorization? One of the hallmarks of my learning disability is poor memorization skills, poor memory skills. I can understand the concepts, but I'm not good with dates. I'm not good with names. But I understand, the ideas of the thing that happened. So for example, tests that required short answer were my strength because I could show that I know. But if it was just what year who, and I had to answer those questions, that does not let you know that I truly did understand this historical concept or this science concept. The next is encouraging a variety of ways to socialize. So everyone has different ways that they like to make friends or acquaintances or to spend their time or to share their time with others. Could we normalize maybe having online clubs, clubs that only meet online after school? Could we have cosplay clubs that maybe address a variety of interests and are not just sports or art, which are good clubs, but also may not include everybody? Could we have a neurodiversity support club? We have a lot of support clubs that help people feel pride in who they are and identify as one way or the other. Could we also add the neurodiversity spectrum to that? Could there be a neurodiverse Pride Day? Could there be a neurodiverse support club day where we all recognize and celebrate? And then finally, not seeing supports as signs of failure. If I have a cold and I take medicine for that, it's not because my body has failed me. I don't feel like a failure that I have succumbed to my cold. I'm just doing something to feel better so that I can do the things I want to do. But we have this tendency to think of supports as waiting for someone to fail and then seeing it as a hallmark of failure. So, this idea that, we'll let somebody continue to go 2-3 years without an augmentative communication device. Let's see if they talk. And instead of waiting for talking to be the gold standard and failure to do that as being the thing that necessitates support, instead encouraging communication, however that comes out. It could be verbal, it could be gesture, it could be with this AAC device. So if someone is struggling with communication, instead of waiting for failure, just give them the device, give them access, give them communication. Same thing with medication. The idea that we're not going to give someone medication for ADHD until they failed where we set these criteria that they have to meet these or fail to meet these in order for them to need medication. I want to wait till it gets really bad before I'm going to offer that medication or that support. Another consideration when seeing, these supports in school is not grouping educational programs by neurotype, having autism programs and still to this day Asperger's programs, and instead grouping children by skills and by how they're learning, so you can present the information, and then of course including everybody, so there's access to everybody, that we're not just saying, okay, these kids who have these labels, they go over here. Supporting teachers to support their students. And I think this is something everyone can get behind, because we all know how hard teachers are working in their classrooms. And, when I spout off all these things that could happen in schools, it's not easy for teachers to do. And a lot of times they're left to do it on their own. Someone says, make this happen, and there's no support for them. There's no support in terms of supplies or professional development classes. Their class sizes are too large. The materials are inappropriate. There's no mentorship to be able to support them along the way. And they're required to implement curriculum in a certain way. So before we can expect these changes to be made in the classroom, we have to support our teachers who are supporting our students. Also, easier access to school-based mental health services. It can be hard to get counseling on an IEP, but the rate of bullying and suicide in the neurodiverse community, and especially the LGBTQ+ community and the autistic community, is high. So you put the intersectionality of someone who is LGBTQ+ and have autism and having maybe ADHD as a comorbid disorder, you've significantly increased the rate of suicide in that community. So it's very important to be able to have access to counseling services or check-ins or some sort of supports. And then also, who is at the table making decisions? Are there representations from neurodiverse groups and other minoritized backgrounds? Again, as Melissa has said, making sure that when we're trying to help, that we're actually being helpful, and we're being helpful by listening to the voices of those who actually need the help and have ideas about how to implement that help.
We can also think about the workplace differently. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic has all affected us in seeing the workplace very differently. And so when we think about neurodiversity in the workplace, oftentimes we think, children might have a learning disability, and then they grow up, and now they're adults, and now they need to get with the program, right? So then we take away all those supports. We don't need them. That was for school. But yet, those supports are important. And also there's different skill sets that come with different neurodiversity, right? For example, I'm a horrible speller. I have a reading disability, and yet I can do mental math like that. And I can, have really strong visual spatial skills. And, there are certain strengths that I bring to the table, and research shows that people with dyslexia can have really strong visual spatial skills. We have to think about neurodiverse individuals for what their strengths are and what they bring to their workplaces and environments, and how can we capitalize on those versus seeing them as a deficit. Are there autistic adults in your workplace who think really logically and really rationally? Are there people with ADHD who can be really hyper-focused and really get stuff done and really be able to hone in on those? And also, what does your board look like? If you have, community leaders coming to your table, who do they look like? Are they representing the neurodiverse community? Are they representing minoritized groups within the neurodiverse community? I think we need to be thinking about that when we are deciding what our workplace is going to look like for everybody. And so in thinking about that, this also goes into a lot of cultural competency. So our explicit expectations of things versus our implicit expectations, can be often culturally different in terms of how much context we add to a conversation versus how much subtext. I'm a high context person. I don't process as much with a high subtext. I'm kind of trying to understand what the context is. Other people are very high subtext. They'll kind of get to the point, but the subtext is going to be pretty broad. And so really thinking about our implicit assumptions of how our company culture is and just is this way, and you kind of will figure it out. Be explicit about that. Don't assume that people can read between the lines, because that's assuming that their cultural orientation is the same as you, their cultural conversation style is the same as you, and their ways of approaching those interactions and understanding is the same as you. Flexible work schedules. We never knew that everyone could work at home, right? Until the pandemic. And yet we've learned like 95% of people can work at home. And so really thinking about how we can have flexible work schedules to really emphasize productivity and to emphasize ways in which we can get work done in different ways. Can we change our start times? You know, how can we be more flexible? We're expecting neurodiverse individuals to be super flexible with adjusting to our needs and adjusting to neurotypical expectations. How can people who are neurotypical be more flexible? And also varying styles of communication. Do we only give oral information? Do we also have visual, speech to text? I use speech to text all the time because it catches all my spelling mistakes. And you know, having that freely accessible really helps me when I'm writing long reports or I'm doing different things that require, you know, accuracy. That's a support I need that helps me be successful. And having that readily available makes it so I don't have to try to just, you know, reread something several times to make sure I've gotten all my spelling mistakes out. Especially in meetings and conferences, we really need to think through this. I don't know how often you have been at a conference that you're at the 90-minute timeline. And as a psychologist, I know that neurotypical people without attentional difficulties in adults, 90 minutes is the limit for their attentional capacity. So when we're approaching that 90 minutes, and I'm thinking at the very least, you know, for the love of everything, let's take a break. And they say, oh, you know, can we go 10 more minutes? Is that okay? Is everyone okay with that? Which is a fake question. It's kind of like when parents are like, can you take out the trash? You know, really thinking we should be backtracking that. At the hour, something new should be happening. You know, a group discussion instead of a lecture, or some community, you know, work or a break. But something different needs to be happening if we really want everybody to be able to process and take in. We recognize we're using a lot of language. We also have our visual presentation up. We also recognize that some people are going to hear some of that and see some of that, but really need to take it home and process it. Everybody learns differently, and we have to be flexible in allowing for those differences so everyone can come to the table, so we can hear more voices, so we can have that diversity of our different learning styles and how we process. So normalizing those things, normalizing things like headphones, stimming, other sensory needs. You know, we definitely shouldn't have people needing to mask at a conference, at a meeting. They should be able to come as they are, and that's going to allow for them to be able to take in the information and to share with others. And also being really aware of neurotypical or Eurocentric norms around, again, as I was mentioning earlier, how we are communicating. Are we using high subtext? Are we using high context? Are we expecting that from others? Are we expecting how they're going to communicate with us going to be the same as how we communicate with them? And so really thinking through all of those pieces.
So we've talked about supports in school, supports in the workplace. What about supports just in society? So I think it's important to move from, again, you know, that paradigm shift from having to make special accommodations or to change the idea that there's so many barriers in order to access these things in society. So for example, subtitles in movies. Can we just have subtitles in movies? Do we need to, you know, talk to the movies, the theater ahead of time and to be able to, you know, use laws in order to say, I need these? Can we just have them? And that way everybody can benefit from them. Sensory-friendly shopping opportunities. I know at the Harris Teeter near my house in the mornings, you know, Thursday morning is senior hour. And so because of COVID, they have asked that, you know, there's a safe space for people who are over 65, who are more vulnerable to COVID, to be able to shop and in a place that they feel is safe. Why not also offering sensory-friendly shopping opportunities so that people who are overwhelmed by noise and lights and bodies and carts and unpredictableness that happens at the Harris Teeter on a Sunday afternoon, you know, could we reduce that? What can we do to make it more accessible? Sensory-friendly clothing options, especially if you're requiring someone to wear a uniform in the workplace or at school. Is this something that is accessible to everybody? I know I went to a school where I had to wear a uniform and it was awful. It was my mother and I, every morning, our mornings were just a battle because I didn't like the way my shoes felt. They were either too tight or too loose. I did not like wearing layers, the shirt underneath of my school sweater. And if the school sweater touched me, it was just too itchy and it would just send me through the roof. But I had to have my sleeves pulled tight. So I couldn't take my sweater off by myself during the day because I couldn't get it back on in a way where the sleeve underneath of the sweater wasn't too squished up. And if I wore it that way, it would send me through the roof. I was just physically uncomfortable. So, making sure that we're providing, providing a place that's safe, but also, that did not set me up for learning by the time I got to school. I was not in a comfortable state or a state that was available for learning. Providing sensory friendly and neurodiverse friendly spaces in healthcare. Think about the healthcare experience. A lot of people who are on the neurodiverse spectrum have other comorbid issues and health concerns like sleep difficulties and digestive disorders, allergies, anxiety, seizures. And so they're going to be making possibly more trips to find healthcare than someone who is neurotypical. But what is that experience like? And are we encouraging that seeking of help that they need? When they go to the doctor's office, are the staff who are behind the desk, are they neurodiverse friendly? Do they have awareness? What does the space look like that they're waiting in? Can they wait somewhere maybe that's quieter, or could they wait somewhere that has a lot less visual distractions? What are we doing to support them? They're trying to access healthcare. How are we helping them access that? And then, of course, a holistic approach to healthcare. We do not have very good information about what neurodiverse brains look like when you combine with sleep difficulties, digestive disorders, sensory processing, anxiety, allergies, seizures. We don't have information to treat their unique constellation of medical symptoms. What can we do to support them so that when we are saying, well, we have supports, that we have supports that are tailored to them, that we know will actually be supports. So next steps. These are just some ideas, right? This is not going to fix everything, but there need to be more specific steps taken either in your workplace or your school setting or your neighborhood, your community, or maybe your house. And so what would be some next steps? You could look up some information, you could access information. These are some blogs. We also have, that include videos and firsthand accounts, and listening to the voices of those on the neurodiverse spectrum from these blogs is a really good first start, because it's really important to hear what people are thinking and feeling firsthand. And then we also have some other helpful links for other websites that could provide additional information, either about neurodiversity or about disability justice. And so again, you continue to grow in your availability to advocate and to be an ally as well. So thank you so much for joining us. We do have some time left. And so if anyone has any questions, we'd be happy to hear them.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I already see great feedback in the chat. And the first question is from Kimberly. So questions that would support the sensory spatial needs for the person with neurodiverse needs could be added. Ooh, is that a question? Sorry, I'm actually reading it. I don't think that's a question. I think that's a statement. Sorry. I'm going to let people raise hands if they have questions. Do we have any questions? Or feel free to jump in and take yourself off mute if you do.
Yeah, just jump in, just ask. Or does anyone have any thoughts or suggestions of things that have worked in their setting, maybe at your workplace or your school or your home, ways that you've amplified the voices of neurodiverse individuals?
I'll say something. This is Joe Green. Hi, I think you guys did a terrific job. I just kept writing down all these great ideas you had, but I keep coming back to the idea, in a universal design. And I mean, I really agree with everything you said, but then part of me also hears what people will say who have people neurodiverse or neurotypical who are also in that same environment where some of the some of the things that people do, I hate to call them behaviors because it has like a negative connotation, but it can be distracting and it can prevent them from learning, and it can, so there's a tension between, and it's hard to figure out what should be acceptable to not be disruptive for others. And I think we have to balance that all out.
Yeah, I think so. In my house, growing up, my dad likes to tap his foot, but it's not just a little tap, it's like a table moving tap. And at dinner, I think it's much more likely to happen because he just come home from work, and he worked very long days and he had a very long commute, and there would be a lot of table tapping. And my mom hated it. And you could just see her stress level, going up. And this was a constant, back and forth, right? My dad's letting off steam, and, his steam is causing my mom to escalate. And so, we figured out that all he had to do was pivot just a little bit so that the table wasn't moving, and, all was right. This is a very simplistic example, but I think the idea is my dad had a right to tap, and my mom had a right to not be, bothered by it. And they had to meet somewhere in the middle. And so I think that's kind of where we are. And the problem is that we're not asking neurotypical folks to meet anybody anywhere. And instead, it's like an all or nothing approach. And if we instead were encouraging our children from young ages to embrace and to, be a little bit more flexible, as Ms. Melissa has said, encouraging neurotypical flexibility, that may end up having more flexible adults who, when someone needs to pace in the background, this is just something they're used to. And I also think it's, you could kind of compare it to maybe someone who is deaf and saying, well, that person who is having a sign language interpreter, that interpreter is, visually distracting to me. And I think that, you would be hard pressed to find too many people who would say, I object to having the sign language interpreter. But even if it is distracting, then it's incumbent upon that person who is not deaf to figure out a way, move yourself, avert your eyes, do something, and you can focus. But, to say that you can't have access to that as someone who is deaf because it could be visually distracting to me, I think it's a similar, parallel where we have to consider, well, what would you do in that situation? You wouldn't say you can't come. You would have to do something to accommodate. But I hear what you're saying, Joan. I think I think you're right. And I think that the more we can think of these ways to be flexible, that when people do bring up those concerns, that we can help them because they'll be more likely to get that buy-in.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to just having a shared priority, that we see that both needs as equally important, right? So we're not saying, automatically the person who needs the support, how do we get their support without bothering others, but how do both peoples have equal needs? I have an anxious client that needs to recite her questions, and she was doing horrible on her tests because she'd get so anxious until she could say the questions out loud. And so her teacher started allowing her to say the questions out loud. She'd have her in a space that was a little less quiet. She actually preferred that, and then she was able to get that done. But the first question, but that was as valid and as equally important as, the kids who wanted more quiet time when they did their questions.
Thanks.
I have two questions in the queue. So the first one is, I understand how supports can be thought of more from an acceptance perspective and not one of failure. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how therapies and early interventions specifically can be designed in a way other than simply to improve someone's abilities. How can this be done in a way that isn't modeling or mirroring neurotypical behaviors, but from a more strength-based approach?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking actually of a program that we have at our center, the interaction group. And in the past, it's been a group that's at times we've had a speech pathologist, a psychologist, an occupational therapist, and young children are brought in. Often they're autistic, they could have other social needs. And the goal is not for them to, have specific social behaviors. We're looking at interaction. How do they kind of think about the interactions of others and engage well in their own way with others and feel competence in that? And how do we help them in their developmental goals while also building that self-confidence, building that shared joy and enjoyment. And so these can be done, I think, when we move away from specific behavioral goals and we move more towards life goals. And what do we want for our children? What are the things that we want for their lives? You know, we want them to be happy, we want them to be joyful, we want them to relate to others. How do we encourage that in a way that can be unique for them, and then still encourages that part of their development?
I think it's also very individualized. I have clients, for example, that want to work on conversation skills because they want to understand a neurotypical way of having a conversation so that they can choose, if they wanted to be able to engage in that or to be able to understand what's happening. And so I have other, clients with whom I work that's not a place of value for them. That's not something. And so I could apply that same to early intervention. You know, what is it that we need to be working on in that moment that is going to improve their life, not necessarily improve the likelihood that they're going to look more neurotypical. And so I alluded to that with echolalia. And so sometimes that's family education. We oftentimes have 2 and 3 and 4-year-olds who come in and are verbally stimming. And we hear a lot of families say things like, quiet mouth, shh, quiet mouth. And instead of just letting them stim, there's no reason to stop that. So some of that, it's not necessarily a goal or objective that's going to be on a plan of care, but it is part of that total whole person approach to supporting the people who support that child. And then also, I think in terms of like play skills, not necessarily saying that you have to be able to play for 4 minutes or you have to be able to take 22 turns in play, but instead looking about how that person wants to play and including their interest in that play. I think this would be very early intervention, specific. And if that child has strengths or intense interest in dinosaurs, for example, or one of my clients really likes stoplights and Google Maps, then a lot of our play and our interactions and the things that we talk about are going to be about Google Maps. And I live in Baltimore City. I commute to Montgomery County. And so he loves teaching me about the different routes and how some streets change names in the middle. And he has favorite stoplights. He now knows my favorite stoplight, and I legitimately have favorite stoplights now, things I didn't know I would have, right? So sharing those interests, I think, and that makes him very good at navigating. But his family asks him, where do we go? We're going to the doctor's office. Do you remember where we turn? And yes, he knows. So, that's a strength of his, and we can use it in play. We can use it in conversation. We can use it in relating. So I don't know. Did that answer your question?
That was my question, Tina.
Mm-hmm.
This is Samaya. Hi. I was gonna say, because I'm thinking about my son, and since he's only 6, it's more challenging when a child can't communicate, what they want to focus on. And so I hear you saying that part of it is like observing and trying to identify what their interests are and possibly even where they might get frustrated. And that might be areas in terms of like how you guys are talking about the experience that they're having with interacting. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. And again, I think it's important to consider just individualizing it, that including interest, may be very important for someone who has a passion or something of high interest. And then, not expecting someone who just likes all the toys and really just wants to line them up and doesn't care, what it is that they're lining up, instead of, expecting someone, if you don't have an area of high interest or something you really like, I can't share this with you. So I think that individualization is really key. And I think we say it a lot, we give it a lot of lip service, but then I think there really needs to be support with, what does that really look like in real life? And are we really doing it? And maybe some internal checks as both therapists and people who support the child as family or parents or whatnot, making sure that we're actually doing that, sort of that self-check every once in a while.
And I guess like one last thing I'll say is, because a lot of the therapy and even like an IEP and stuff tends to be towards, in a sense, like this idea of trying to make a child more functional in a classroom setting. And that somewhat goes against what you guys are talking about, And so I was just trying to think through that a bit.
I'm sorry, Melissa, did you want to say something?
I mean, I would say you're right that, I think that kind of gets to our paradigm shift. Like, what does it mean to be functional in a classroom environment? Does that mean you're feeling good about your learning, you're able to access learning, and you're enjoying where you are? Or does that mean you're helping other people feel more comfortable with your behavior? And so those key distinctions, I think, are the difference between actual, like, improving your functioning or kind of making you more, quote unquote, neurotypical. So that's why I would say the distinction is really helping that individual feel successful and feel connected and feel like they can process learning. Then yes, that would be improving their functioning.
And I can give you an example. When I was in first grade, I didn't know I had a learning disorder, and certainly in the 80s, that wasn't that just talked about. There weren't, that wasn't the awareness wasn't there. I just knew math was hard. And I can remember, my math teacher having me sit on my left hand so that I could not use my fingers to count, because they thought that being functional meant being able to count in your head. And so using my fingers meant, they told me I was either cheating or that I was, I was being a baby, that's something a baby did. And that, you were a big girl and you had to learn to count in your head and do the adding and everything, because that's how they define functional. Functional looked like adding in your head. But to me at the time, functional just looked like getting through this math homework, just being able to figure out what possibly could 2 + 2 look like. And, now functional is being able to figure out a tip at a restaurant, or, if you see it's going to be 25% off, okay, well, what is this cost going to be when I get to the register? That's functional. And I don't care right now if I count on my toes, my fingers, I don't care what I count on. I just want to know the answer. So that's how I function. That is functional for me. And I think that goes to Melissa's point of defining not just the thing that you're doing, but the starting point is, well, what is the functional outcome? What is it you think is functional? And are you on the same page as the person who you're thinking for? Do you both think that the same thing is functional?
Thank you for that wonderful question, Sam. The next question I have is, please help me understand how the concept of neurodiversity relates to the concept of disability.
Yeah, I think it's a broader term. And so, when I think about having a reading disability, that does make it harder. Things like irregular words are confusing. I don't understand. I'm poor at spelling irregular words because they don't have a phonetic basis, or words that are spelled multiple different ways. I actually noticed a spelling mistake in our PowerPoint, but that goes to how we think about how words are spelled. And so, yeah, that does affect how my brain thinks. But I think when you move from that idea of a reading disability into then how is my brain neurodiverse? How do I think of things differently? Like I said, I can communicate in language quite well, as long as you can take my spelling mistakes. I can think about things visually and visually spatially, and I work well with my hands, and I have, so my brain is different, right? It's diverse. And neurodiversity, can take, yes, I struggle with certain aspects of reading and writing. And also, this is how my brain looks. This is the diversity of what I bring, and how can we accomplish that? And so a lot of our, the concept of neurodiversity is newer than the concept of disability, because that's kind of like we focused in on that thing, and that thing is real. And yet there's a broader aspect of that, and how it's helping our brains, and how we're thinking differently, and how that diversity in our thoughts and our processing actually improves the communication we have with others and improves our surrounding, right? We think about biodiversity, neurodiversity. It actually is encouraging creative thinking and multiple aspects of coming to a problem and communicating with one another. Tina, did you have anything else to say about that?
No, not really. I mean, I think the only thing to think about would be also how, that's on a broad scale, but then, personally, someone may think of their neurodiversity, Melissa, as you said, this thing is a disability to me. So my label in and of itself isn't, but in the same way Melissa found a spelling error, I also cannot spell. And so I did not catch that either. And so what happens when two people who have, differences in the same area make a presentation, you get spelling errors. But I think that, that whereas some days I don't even consider myself having a learning disorder. It doesn't occur to me that this is something my brain is walking around with this DSM label somewhere in a paper somewhere. I don't think of myself in that way. But when I have to do my taxes, I think of myself as a person with a learning disability 100% of the time, because it is very obvious to me that I am struggling with this thing that someone else is not. And, you know, when people say I did my taxes this afternoon, I'm like, well, so that's great that you were able to do that in less than a day, because it takes me a very long time. I don't feel good about my math. And now, thankfully, with, you know, TurboTax, that anxiety is, you know, lifted. But I think the idea is that I'm not embarrassed by the fact that I have this label. I'm happy to discuss it, but not everybody is, and not everybody feels like they can kind of unmask in that way. And so then that to them is, you know, is the disability. I also think it's important to consider that I don't have a learning disability at home per se. It's when I step out of my door into the environment, into the world, that I feel that I have this disability. Otherwise, it's just my brain. I'm just me. I'm just how my brain works. And so, you know, I think a lot of it is how you feel on the inside, but also how does the society, how does the environment impact you? And does that amplify what you feel like is a disability? But I think you can have both. I think you can be neurodiverse and proud of it and have certain aspects that are disabling to you, or either because of the way society is, or because just, you know, your environment is.
Thank you for the answers, and thank you for the question. Tina, are you an influencer for TurboTax?
I know I should be, right?
All right, all seriousness, there is another question. Can you speak to how an ADHD coach can support an adolescent?
Yeah, so, you know, one, I think getting to know that person, really knowing what are the things they enjoy, what are the things they do really well, you know, what are those things that they feel super competent in and they've worked hard at and they do really well, and really kind of targeting that, you know, as a, you know, from that standpoint. ADHD is also on a spectrum. So individuals who have ADHD are going to have varying levels of, you know, different strengths and different needs. And so, you know, it's not just being more ADHD or less ADHD. You're going to have different levels of how well you can get started on tasks, how well you can divide your attention, how easily you might get distracted on things, how well you can hyper focus, how often you're thinking of multiple, you know, creative ideas. And so all of those things we need to put together when we're trying to understand that individual. But I think when we are giving that message, the message should continually be about how much they bring, right? How their neurodiversity brings so much to the table and brings so much to the people that they're around. And so starting from that, understanding them as an individual, what their individual strengths and needs are on that spectrum, and then how you can support them.
Thank you, Melissa, for answering that. That's all the questions I see in the queue. So I'll give it another minute. If anybody has any additional questions, please feel free to ask.
And we appreciate all the questions.
Yeah. Thank you for everyone's thoughts and feedback.
Yeah, I think we can wrap it up, avoid the awkward silence of waiting. I feel awkward. I don't know. So thank you guys. Thank you so much for this presentation. It is wonderful. There's already so much wonderful feedback in the chat. I know everybody got so much out of this, so many notes, just as Joan said. So thank you, Melissa and Tina, for your time putting this together, all the knowledge that you shared with us. Thank you, everybody who joined today on a Friday. Truly appreciate it, and be on the lookout for the recording that everybody will receive later today. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Great, thank
Olga,
you, everyone.
I have a question. Are we allowed to share the recording once we get it?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you for the kind feedback, everybody. I really appreciate seeing it in the chat.